Hello friends, the unit for the day is vertical integration. We will learn about topics like characteristics and extent of vertical integration, theories of vertical integration, costs associated, benefits and limitations of vertical integration. Friends, let's understand the introduction now. The primary goal of any organization is achieving higher level of performance, where performance is a comprehensive term including profitability, efficiency and effectiveness in its quest for corporate advantage. Profitable growth allows companies to have advantages of economies of scale and economies of scope as well. Hence, growth strategies become a means towards more sales revenues, more employees, more market share and an important option to help improve odds against greater competition and uncertainty. Considering this objective, there are basically two types of growth strategies: A. Concentration and B. Diversification. Friends, let's understand about A. Concentration. The firm grows by expanding the business relating to its existing scope through integrating into businesses either vertically or horizontally or both. Cost savings, uncertainty, monopoly motives, technological interdependence, etc. can be incentives to integrate. B. Diversification. The firm grows by extending its scope, that is, going into new businesses, or it can even enter into businesses that are totally unrelated to its existing scope. This session explains the various aspects of vertical integration by briefly considering the nature and extent of vertical integration and theories of vertical integration so far market structure is concerned. Friends, let's understand the meaning of vertical integration. The term vertical integration is used in two distinct ways in industrial economics. First, it relates to an existing state or organizational structure. In this sense, it refers to the extent to which a single business unit carries on successive stages in the processing and distribution of a product. In addition, the term is used to refer to behavior or conduct. It refers to the action of a firm in moving into another processing or distributing stage, either via vertical merger or by setting up new production or distribution facilities. When a firm moves into production of raw materials and inputs, backward integration is said to take place, while a move towards final production and distribution is called forward integration. Friends, let's understand the characteristics of vertical integration. Number 1. Vertical integration is the converse of specialization with reference to structure. A firm is completely specialized if it undertakes only a single process or function in the production chain. Number 2. Integration extends beyond ancillary or support services to take in production of major raw materials and components and further production and distribution. Number 3. It involves direction of economic activities within a firm. Many transactions take place in the market and are coordinated by price mechanism. Within a firm, however, the price mechanism is superseded by entrepreneurial control of economic activity. Number 4. Vertical integration by one firm shifts production from the non-integrated firms to the integrated firm, which produces a lower quantity per unit of capacity. As a consequence, vertical integration is more likely to be anti-competitive when the industry consists of a large number of firms. Number 5. As vertical integration leads to larger capacity purchases of the integrating firm, aggregate capacity employed in the industry rises. This effect counteracts the effect that the integrated firm utilizes its capacity less intensively. If all firms have considerable market power, the effect of less intensive capacity utilization is small. Therefore, the dominating effect is that aggregate capacity increases, implying that even vertical integration to full foreclosure can be pro-competitive. Number 6, as vertical integration shifts capacity to the integrated firm that utilizes it less intensively, aggregate cost of production increase with vertical integration. This may render vertical integration welfare reducing even when it is consumer surplus enhancing. Number 7, vertical integration reduces the monopsony distortion, thereby inducing the integrated firm to acquire more capacity and to produce more output. If a firm acquires such a large amount of capacity that its competitors stop producing, the overall market capacity used in production can become so large that the resulting monopoly quantity is larger than the oligopoly quantity without the capacity increase. Interestingly, in this case, the efficiency effect of vertical integration outweighs the negative effects of monopolization on the downstream market. Friends, let's understand the extent of vertical integration. Very little evidence is available on the extent of vertical integration. Generally, it is seen in industries such as petroleum, iron and steel, motor assembly, footwear, brewing, flour milling and baking, and even man-made fibers. Friends, let's understand the neoclassical approaches to explaining vertical integration. The explanation of the causes and consequences of vertical integration that emerged in the field of industrial organization during the post-World War II period was heavily influenced by the sharp distinction drawn by neoclassical economics between resource allocation mediated through markets and resource allocation that takes place within private firms and related types of hierarchical organizations, for example, public enterprises. Microeconomics in general and applied price theory in particular were concerned with the way anonymous spot markets worked to allocate resources. The factors that determined the boundaries between the firms and markets were largely ignored, and issues associated with the internal organization of firms and the way firms allocated resources internally were viewed as outside of the domain of economics. Firms were conceptualized as production sets that defined the technologically most efficient opportunities to transform inputs into outputs. They relied on anonymous spot markets to buy and sell inputs and outputs. That is, what firms did and what markets did were complementary activities. Coase's view in 1937 and even in 1972 was that firms and markets were substitute governance mechanisms was not an accepted part of received wisdom until relatively recently. Precisely what was in a firm's production set and what was not was at best rather vague, and there existed no meaningful economic theory to explain where to draw the line between firms and market transactions, or to explain the diverse types of non-standard contractual arrangements observed in the real world. Industrial organization theorists like Bain, who wrote in 1956 and 1959, viewed that the relevant firm production set rather narrowly as encompassing activities that were clearly physically related to one another. Both multi-plant economies and vertical integration downstream and upstream were generally viewed as being unnecessary for a firm to produce at minimum cost in the absence of technological relationships that physically joined production between plants. Instead, the presumption was that vertical integration and non-standard vertical contractual agreements reflected responses to market power that existed in upstream or downstream markets, or both, and reflected efforts to create or exploit market power. This is the fundamental basis for neoclassical theories of vertical integration. Friends, let's understand the vertical externalities. A classical explanation for vertical integration is as a response to inefficiencies that arise when there is market power in both the upstream and the downstream markets. This in turn implies that market prices will be greater than the marginal cost of production in both upstream and downstream markets. This in turn implies that the market prices will be greater than the marginal cost of production in both upstream and downstream markets as firms exercise market power. The polar case is one where there is a pure monopoly upstream, that is manufacturing, and another pure monopoly downstream, that is retailing, and where the upstream monopoly has all of the bargaining power over the price that will be charged for goods and services sold by the upstream firm to the downstream firm. The monopoly at the upstream manufacturing level has a marginal production cost C and seeks to charge a monopoly input price PM, which is greater than C, to the downstream firm. The downstream retail monopoly takes the price PM as its input cost and exercises its monopoly power by charging a retail price PRM, which is greater than PM. Friends, let's understand the issue of double marginalization created out of this. The upstream monopoly adds a monopoly markup to its production costs, and then the downstream monopoly adds another markup to the price it pays to the upstream firm for its inputs. This phenomenon is known as double marginalization. When making its pricing decisions, the downstream monopoly ignores, because it does not see, the actual costs of production incurred by the upstream firm. This behavior of the independent monopolies results in aggregate profits that are smaller than they would be in the firms who set prices so as to maximize their joint profits. It also leads to higher prices downstream than would maximize the joint profits of the upstream and downstream firms. If we assume that vertical integration is costless, the aggregate profits of the two monopolies will increase if they merge, since the distortion from double marginalization will disappear. The integrated firm will set the profit maximizing downstream monopoly price, properly taking into account the actual cost of production at the upstream level. Moreover, prices charged to consumers will fall, and as a result, consumers are made better off by vertical integration. This is the classic example of the maxim that a single monopoly is better than a chain of monopolies. This approach treats vertical integration itself as being costless compared to alternative institutional arrangements. That is, no internal organization costs are recognized, but only any costs created by distortions in the market prices, quantities, or the factor proportions used to produce output from a neoclassical production function. Accordingly, it identifies the potential benefits of vertical integration to the firms, but not any associated costs that the firms may bear when they enter additional lines of business and expand the size and scope of activities undertaken by the firm. Costless vertical integration here is effectively being used as a benchmark against which alternative costless contractual arrangements could be compared. So, for example, distortions arising in one way or another as a consequence of double marginalization can be solved, as well as with alternative assumed costless contractual arrangements, that is simple linear transfer prices, two-part tariffs, maximum retail price maintenance, quantity forcing contracts, requirement contracts, etc. Thus, vertical integration and a menu of non-standard vertical contractual arrangements are all substitute mechanisms for solving the same double marginalization problem. Absent transaction cost of some type, the alternative instruments are all equally attractive mechanisms for responding to double marginalization. In situations where double marginalization is a problem, however, it may be that relying on two-part tariffs or retail price maintenance or some other non-standard contractual arrangement may give superior results once organizational and contracting costs are taken into account. Note that the double marginalization problem does not arise here if the downstream market is perfectly competitive. In that case, the downstream retail firms are price takers and simply pass along the manufacturer's monopoly price PM. There is now only one monopoly distortion. However, introducing uncertainty about the downstream firm's costs and demand by the upstream firm and risk aversion by downstream firms has the effect of making non-standard vertical contractual arrangements more attractive than simple linear monopoly pricing, and ignoring organization costs makes vertical integration potentially profitable as well. Regardless of the competitive structure of the downstream market, if the downstream firms have production function that allow for some substitution between an input they purchase from an upstream monopoly and an input they can buy in a competitive market, then by charging a price above its marginal cost, an upstream monopoly will induce the downstream firm inefficiently to substitute away from the monopoly priced input and use more of the competitively priced. Vertical integration in this case can restore an efficient utilization of inputs used in the production of the downstream good or service and increase aggregate profits for the firms. However, a tying contract that ties sales of the competitively supplied input and the monopoly supplied input together in a way that reflects the input's relatively marginal production cost can have the same effect. If the downstream market is characterized by a monopoly, absent vertical integration, resale price maintenance, that is RPM, specifying a maximum retail price would have to be added as well to the tying contract in order to mitigate the downstream price as well as input utilization effects of double marginalization. In that case, a franchisee fee or two-part tariff structured so that the marginal price is the manufacturer's marginal cost of production will also restore the right input utilization incentives and correct the downstream price distortion resulting from double marginalization. The overall welfare effects of vertical integration or these substitute non-standard vertical contracts when there is market power upstream and input substitution possibilities downstream are positive, although the effect on consumer prices is ambiguous when the downstream market is competitive. Of course, monopoly upstream and downstream or monopoly upstream and perfect competition downstream are both extreme cases. More realistic cases will involve imperfect competition both upstream and downstream. The double marginal problem will still arise if firms at both levels of the production chain have some market power, as they will mark up their prices above their actual or perceived marginal cost in qualitatively, though not quantitatively, the same way as in the standard chain of monopolies case. The opportunity to eliminate or reduce this double marginalization problem still creates incentive for vertical integration or reliance on the types of alternative non-standard vertical contractual arrangements. However, when there is imperfect competition upstream and downstream rather than pure monopolies at both levels ex ante, vertical integration may also have effects on the intensity of competition upstream and or downstream and associated price cost margins and profits. This will in turn affect the incentives to vertically integrate, the distribution of profits between firms resulting from vertical integration and consumer prices. Friends, let's understand the horizontal externalities. Another potential source of incentives for vertical integration is the free rider problem associated with the provision of pre-sale information and post-sale service by competing downstream retailers. Here, upstream firms manufacture branded or differentiated products so that they face a downward sloping demand for each product. Moreover, the demand for the upstream firm's product is affected by downstream retail sales and service activity and associated expenditures that are made by downstream retailers of their products. If retailers cannot fully appropriate for themselves the benefits of retail service expenditures, but instead see some of the benefits accrue to their downstream retail competitors, this horizontal externality will lead to downstream retailers to underinvest in retail service from the perspective of the manufacturer. Friends, let's see how does vertical integration help in this case. Vertical integration is one potential solution to this problem. It would allow the upstream manufacturer to internalize the value of expenditures on sales and service at the retail or downstream level. So too are various combinations of exclusive territorial agreements, minimum resale price maintenance, profit pass-over contracts and other vertical contractual mechanisms. As usual, absent the consideration of the transactional and organizational cost, the unanswered question is how to choose among the alternative institutional arrangements in a systematic way. Friends, let's understand what is vertical foreclosure. Vertical integration and long-term vertical contracts can be used strategically to soften competition in the short run by raising rivals' costs or in the long run by increasing the costs of entry to foreclose rivals that might otherwise enter the market. Here, it is important to distinguish between a naive view of market foreclosure, that is, sometimes associated with vertical integration, and the issues that arise as a result of the strategic use of vertical integration to soften competition, to raise prices in the upstream market, the downstream market, or both. Whenever a firm vertically integrates and self-supplies itself with some input, other potential suppliers are in some sense foreclosed from providing those input supplies to the vertically integrated firm. By this definition, all vertical integration forecloses competition. This is not a useful or sensible notion of anti-competitive vertical foreclosure. The classic case of potentially anti-competitive vertical foreclosure arises when there is monopoly over the supply of some essential facility or bottleneck resource input that competing or potentially competing firms need access to at comparable terms and conditions in order to compete in a downstream market. A high voltage electric power transmission network is an example of an essential facility in this sense because electricity generating firms must have access to the transmission network to produce and sell their output efficiently. A firm that controls the essential facility and also competes in the downstream market may find it profitable to deny access to that facility or charge a higher price to third parties seeking to use the facility in order to sustain its monopoly in the downstream market. The classic response to this argument is that there is only one monopoly profit to be had here, and that by charging a monopoly price for access to the essential facility, the firm that controls it can extract all the monopoly rents that are potentially available. It does not need to restrict access to the facility, nor can it extend its monopoly into a downstream market in a way that further disadvantages consumers. This argument breaks down in a number of cases. When the price for access to the essential facility is regulated, the firm that controls it may find it attractive to restrict access to it in order to restrict entry into unregulated markets in which the owner of the essential facility is also a competing supplier. Vertical foreclosure arguments often arise as regulated, vertically integrated monopolies are subject to public policies that open up opportunities for competitors to enter one or more lines of business served by the vertically integrated firm. So, for example, the development of competitive wholesale markets for electric power requires competing generators and their customers to have access to an electric transmission network which has natural monopoly characteristics. A firm that both controls the transmission network and is also a competitor in the power market that relies on this transmission network may have the incentive and ability to use the terms and conditions of access to that network to reduce competition in the competitive power market. Friends, let's understand what other theories say about vertical integration. Dennis Carlton in 1979 has shown how the combination of uncertain demand for inputs and the failure of markets to be cleared by spot prices under some contingencies can create a private incentive for downstream firms to integrate backwards, partially or fully for supply security reasons. The strong incentives for vertical integration arise because the vertically integrated firm is able to satisfy high probability demand by itself and pass on the low probability demand to some other firm. George Stigler, 1951, proposed a theory of vertical integration based upon Adam Smith's famous maxim that the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. Stigler advanced a dynamic or life cycle theory of vertical integration. He argued that in an infant industry producing a new downstream product, vertical integration would be more likely to occur because the demand for specialized inputs would be too small to support independent firms supplying intermediate goods. As the demand for the new product grows, intermediate good suppliers whose production is characterized by increasing returns would be spun off as independent firms supplying inputs to multiple competing downstream suppliers. Stigler's theory turns primarily on economies and diseconomies of scale and the implicit assumption that suppliers of new products require specialized inputs. It ignores transaction costs associated with both internal organization and market contracting. Acemoglu, Johnson and Mitton in 2005 proposed a theory in which imperfections in capital markets, regulation and contracting costs create incentives for vertical integration, though its ability to overcome these market imperfections by moving transactions from imperfect markets into less costly hierarchical allocation structures. This theory provides a bridge between the traditional neoclassical theories of vertical integration and substitute vertical contractual restraints that arise either as response to market power or efforts to create or enhance market power, and those theories that focus more on the comparative costs of internal organization and an array of market-based contractual alternatives to internal organization. Vertical integration is favored when the benefits of justifying opportunism problems that may arise as a consequence of specific investments are greater than the costs of other sources of static and dynamic inefficiency that may be associated with resource allocation within bureaucratic organizations. Friends, let's understand what are the costs associated here. Accordingly, the organizational economics literature adopts the perspective that there are benefits and costs of vertical or horizontal or lateral integration. They are: number 1, market transactions incur transactions costs associated with writing and enforcing contingent contracts. Number 2, the costs of internal organization are associated with the relatively inferior adaptive properties of bureaucratic hierarchies to rapidly changing outside opportunities over the longer term, and the difficulty of designing compensation mechanisms to give managers and employees appropriate incentives to control costs and product quality. No governance structure is free from at least some transaction costs. The decision whether or not to vertically integrate then becomes a trade-off between the costs of alternative governance arrangements. Governance arrangements are selected which represent the best that can be accomplished from a set of imperfect governance alternatives. Friends, let's understand the benefits of vertical integration. Number 1. Transaction costs. In many cases, a major objective of vertical integration is to eliminate or at least greatly reduce the buying and the selling cost incurred when separate companies own two stages of production and perhaps the physical handling costs as well. Number 2. Supply assurance. Vertical integration may also be essential to assure a supply of critical materials. Certainly, this aspect of vertical integration has been a major attraction of the strategy to the petroleum industry, both in its early days and more recently in the OPEC-dominated 1970s. Number 3. Improved coordination. Even when supply of materials are certain, vertical integration may permit cost reductions through improved coordination of production and inventory scheduling between stages. Some argue that an in-house supplier can schedule production more efficiently when it has firm commitments from a downstream manufacturing or distribution facility than when it deals with independent customers. Number 4. Technological capabilities. Some claim that in general businesses and companies that are vertically integrated, especially backward, are best equipped to innovate because they participate in many of the production and distribution activities in which change can occur. Number 5. Higher entry barriers. The more vertically integrated a business, the greater the financial and managerial resources required to enter and compete in it. Established companies in an industry may combine their operations as a way of raising the stakes and discouraging potential new entrants. Friends, let's understand what are the issues with vertical integration. Number 1. Capital requirements. When a business integrates either backward or forward, it must provide the capital that the newly integrated operations require. The implication is that unless the operating cost savings of vertical integration are substantial, investment intensity will make integration strategies unprofitable. Number 2. Unbalanced output. A problem inherent in combining various stages of production or distribution is the varying scale of operation that each stage may require for efficient functioning. The fact that scale requirements differ among vertically linked activities suggests that integrated businesses must either operate on a scale large enough to satisfy the requirements of the most volume dependent production stages or suffer the penalties of operating on inefficient scales at one or more stages. An implication of this line of reasoning is that vertical integration is probably more feasible for businesses with high market shares, which relative to competitors in that market involve large-scale operations. Number 3. Reduced flexibility. Because vertical integration implies commitment to a particular technology or way of operating, it can be an extremely risky strategy. If technology or market changes make the products or methods of one stage in a vertically integrated system obsolete, the integrated company may find adjusting very difficult. Number 4. Loss of specialization. A somewhat hard to pinpoint but often important danger of vertical integration is the very distinct managerial approaches that the various stages of production or distribution may require. For instance, retail or wholesale distribution operations seem to need forms of organization, control systems and management styles that are quite different from those for manufacturing and processing. Friends, let's summarize the session now. In this session, various aspects of vertical integration are considered, especially with the reference to monopoly firms. Various factors provide an incentive for vertical integration. Incentives for integration may exist because of technological interdependencies or market uncertainty, or as a consequence of industry life cycle considerations. Market power is also an important determinant. So far monopolistic integration is concerned, they may put restraint on input substitution and possible entry barriers. Vertical integration can be socially beneficial, especially when cost savings are considered. Friends, we got to learn a lot about vertical integration. Thank you.